A crucified, wise moral teacher might inspire sympathy. He might even be remembered as a tragic figure, but he would not launch a movement that reshapes history forever. The earliest Christians didn't stop at Jesus died. Their message was, Jesus died, and then something happened that changed history forever. The resurrection is the boldest claim in Christianity. If you're going to doubt anything, this is where it makes the most sense to focus. Not on the edges, but on the very center of it. Welcome back to Align Podcast. This is episode 7. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Let's dive right in. Christians don't just say Jesus was inspiring. They don't just say he taught beautiful things about love and forgiveness. Christians typically claim he was dead on Friday and alive again on Sunday. That's not a small claim. That's not Jesus changed my life or Jesus gives me purpose. That's a concrete historical claim about something that either happened in the real world or didn't happen at all. And here's my conviction. If you're going to doubt Christianity, doubt it here. If the resurrection didn't happen, if Jesus stayed dead, then the rest of this falls apart. But if it did happen, then it changes everything. In this episode, I want to walk through the basic historical case for the resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb, the eyewitness claims, the early preachings, and what the church said happened, and also some of the main alternative explanations. The core question is simple, but it's massive. Is the resurrection historically credible? Before we argue about whether the resurrection is believable, we first need to be clear about what the earlier sources actually claim. People imagine that the resurrection story slowly evolved over time, that maybe Jesus died and people kept his teachings alive, and only much later did stories about him rising from the dead begin to circulate. But when you actually read the earliest Christian writings, that's not the picture you get. That's not what you see. When you look across the sources, the Gospels, the early letters circulating in the Christian movement, the same core story keeps appearing again and again. The claim is straightforward and it is specific. Jesus was publicly executed by crucifixion. He was buried. On the third day, his tomb was found empty, and his followers claimed that he appeared to them alive again. Not just one person in a private vision, but to multiple people in multiple settings, in different places. The sources describe appearances to individuals, to small groups, to large gatherings, to devoted followers, and sometimes it was even to people who were skepticals at first. And just as important as the appearance were themselves, what happened afterward is what we should also look at. The same disciples who had scattered in fear when Jesus was arrested, the same disciples who had locked themselves away and assumed that the movement was over, all of a sudden began to publicly proclaim that God had raised him from the dead. They didn't quietly preserve his teachings as legends of a fallen teacher. They proclaimed something far more radical happened, that the man who was crucified was now alive again, and that this event meant that God had vindicated him as Lord and as Messiah. This message wasn't whispered in private circles, it was preached publicly, including in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been executed. And their entire way of life began to revolve around that conviction. Their worship changed. Their preaching centered around his resurrection. Their mission expanded outward from the point of his resurrection. One of the clearest windows we have into this early belief comes from a short summary of resurrection messages that scholars widely recognize as an early creed, a kind of memorized proclamation that circulated among the first Christians. And it reads like this: Christ died, Christ was buried, Christ was raised on the third day, and Christ appeared to many witnesses. What makes this especially important is where we find it in. That summary appears inside one of the earliest surviving Christian letters. It is in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, and you can find it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 7. But most scholars agree that the formula itself is older than the letter, meaning that it was already being repeated and passed along long before Paul wrote down the letter. In other words, belief in the resurrection was not a late theological development. It was already there at the very beginning of the movement. So, from the start, Christianity isn't built on the vague idea that Jesus lives on through his teachings, or that his followers simply felt inspired after his death. The earlier sources are staking everything on something far more concrete: a tomb that was empty. Appearances that people claim to have witnessed, and the movement that explodes into public history because its earliest followers were convinced that something extraordinary had happened. Whether someone ultimately believes that claim or not is another question, but historically speaking, it is important to recognize what the first Christians were actually saying. They weren't claiming a metaphor, they were claiming an event that occurred in this real world. Let's start with the empty tomb. Why does it matter? See, if Jesus' body was still in the grave, the resurrection message would have been incredibly easy to shut down. The earliest Christians, their preaching didn't happen centuries later in a distant place. It began in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been executed and buried. So if the body was still there, somebody would have simply pointed to the tomb and said, nope, but he's still here. That's it. The story ends there. That's why the empty tomb matters historically. It's not just a religious symbol, it's a claim about something that could have been checked and verified. According to the earliest accounts, when people went to the tomb on the third day, it was empty. There's an interesting detail in those accounts. They say that the first people to discover the tomb empty were women. In our modern world, that might not stand out as much. But in the first century, specifically Jewish and Greco-Roman world, women were not generally considered as the strongest legal witnesses in any formal setting. That doesn't mean that their testimonies meant nothing. But culturally, if you were inventing a story meant to persuade people into believing what you're saying, you probably wouldn't choose women as your primary discoverers of one of the most important events in your story. In the last episode, we talked about what scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. It meant that if a detail is awkward, shameful, or hard to explain, it's less likely to be invented. If you were inventing this story in the first century Jewish and Greco-Roman world, you would likely choose a well-known male disciple or a respected leader. Yet, the accounts say that women were the first to the tomb and were the first to see the tomb empty. From a historical perspective, that detail actually works against the idea that the story was carefully engineered for maximum credibility. It reads much more like a kind of detail that gets preserved because that was what unfolded. There's another point that often gets overlooked. When you look at the early responses to Christian message, critics don't usually deny the tomb was empty. Instead, they try to explain why it was empty. One of the earliest explanations we hear is the claim that the disciples stole the body. Now, notice what kind of response this assumes. Number one, it assumes that the body wasn't there. The debate, in other words, wasn't about whether the tomb was empty. The debate was about how it became empty. And that's an important distinction because historically, when both supporters and critics of a movement are working from the same basic facts but offering different explanation for it, it usually means that the fact was widely known and difficult to deny. Now, it's important to be clear about something. An empty tomb by itself doesn't prove resurrection. There are several ways a tomb can be empty. A body could simply be moved. A burial location could have been confused. Something else could have happened that we don't fully understand. But what the empty tomb does is it creates a question that demands an explanation. If the earliest Christians were publicly proclaiming that Jesus had been raised from the dead and the tomb associated with his burial was empty, then the historical task is to ask, what best explains this situation? You may accept the resurrection explanation, you may reject it, but if we're being intellectually honest with the story, we can't simply ignore the empty tomb. It's one of the pieces of the puzzle of history that has to be accounted for. Next, we have the eyewitness claims. The early Christian message is not just we found an empty grave. It is we saw him alive. That distinction matters because an empty tomb by itself leaves room for many possible explanations. But when people start saying that they actually encountered the person who had been executed, that raises a much bigger historical question. The earliest sources describe appearances to different kinds of people in different settings, some in what we call individual encounters. For example, the appearance to Mary Magdalene or Simon Peter. Others involve a small group of people such as the circle of disciples, often referred to as the 12. And some accounts describe larger gatherings. One early summary mentions an appearance to more than 500 people at one time. What's interesting about that detail is that the source presenting it says many of those people were still alive when the claim was circulating. Essentially, it's inviting people to check with those people who were still alive at the time the claim was circulating. That kind of statement only makes sense in a context where eyewitness testimony still mattered and could potentially be challenged. The reports also describe encounters in a wide variety of circumstances. Some happened indoors, others take place in location on the roadside or on the hillside. Some occur during ordinary activities like walking or eating. In other words, the appearances are not presented as a single isolated visionary experience. They are described as multiple encounters across different times and locations involving different groups of people. Alongside these claims, you see something else that historians pay attention to: a dramatic transformation in the lives of the followers of Jesus. Just days before the crucifixion, the disciples appeared fearful and scattered. When Jesus is arrested, most of them run for their lives. Yet, not long afterwards, those same individuals begin to publicly proclaim that God has raised Jesus from the dead. And they don't do it quietly. They preach openly in Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus had been executed. They challenge the authorities who had condemned Jesus. They continue preaching even after they had been threatened, beaten, and imprisoned. This shift is historically striking simply because movements usually collapse when their leaders are executed or disgraced. Followers will typically reinterpret the teacher's message, the leader's message, into a new type of teaching, or they'll just quietly disperse. But in this case, the opposite happens. The death of Jesus becomes the center of the message, and the claims that he rose from the dead becomes the driving force of the movement. Now, it's important to say something carefully here. People absolutely can suffer and die for beliefs that they are mistaken of. History is full of examples of sincere people defending ideas that turned out to be false. But there's a difference between dying for something you believe is true and dying for something you know you invented. The earliest Christians' witnesses are not just saying we believe Jesus' teachings were right. They are saying we encountered him alive even after his execution. That's a totally different category of claims. And that brings us back to the central question: what best explains their certainty? What explains the sudden courage of people who had been terrified just days before? What explains why they were willing to build their lives, and in some cases lose their lives, around this proclamation? You may conclude that they were mistaken, or Maybe something extraordinary really did happen. But whatever explanation we offer has to account for both pieces of the historical picture. People claiming to have seen the risen Jesus and a movement that explodes outward from their conviction. At this point, many people will say, okay, something happened, but resurrection, really? So let's briefly walk through some common alternatives and ask how they compare. Number one, hallucinations. Maybe the disciples had grief-induced vision of Jesus. That might explain some individual experiences, but it struggles with the variety of the reports. Different times, different places, different groups, including skeptics. Hallucinations are usually private. They are not shared in consistent ways by crowds, and hallucinations don't explain an empty tomb. So, that moves us to explanation number two. A stolen body. Maybe someone took the body of Jesus. If the disciples did it, then they launched a movement solely based on something they knew was false, and they were willing to suffer for it. In some cases, die for it. That's possible, but it raises its own psychological question if they actually did that. Now, if the enemies took the body, they had every possible reason you could think of to reproduce the body as soon as the resurrection preaching began. And that takes us to the third alternative, which is maybe they went to the wrong tomb. Maybe they were in the wrong place. But this was a public execution with a known burial site under the supervision of authorities. The idea that everyone, followers, and even enemies alike, just happen to forget where the tomb was doesn't fit well in this situation. And that brings us to the fourth alternative. This was a legend. Maybe Jesus stayed dead and resurrection stories only developed gradually. So the problem with this is how early the resurrection message began to appear. It's not a late embellishment. It's something that was at the center of Christian preaching from the very beginning. It shows up in early letters, in early creeds, in early public proclamations. None of these alternatives are ridiculous by themselves. But when you line them up with the empty tomb, the appearance claims, the early proclamation, the transformed lives, it's fair to ask, which explanation actually fits the full picture best? Here's where all of this leads. The resurrection is not something that Christians added centuries later to sort of make the story more dramatic. Resurrection is baked into the earliest layers of the movement itself. That still leaves each of us with a decision to make. You might not be ready to say, yes, this definitely happened. But you might be ready to say, I can see why thoughtful people have found this compelling. In the final episode of this series, we're going to move from evidence to response. If there is even a serious case to consider, what do we do with it? Who do you say Jesus is? As we close, I want to ask you a very personal question. What would count as enough evidence for you? Not for some ideal person, but for you. What will count as enough evidence? Have you ever really examined the resurrection claims? I'm talking beyond slogans, beyond what we've come to accept over times, either Christian slogans or skeptical slogans. Or have you mostly lived off of secondhand impressions of what you've heard about Jesus? You might walk away still unconvinced, and that's okay. But if you can at least say, I see that this isn't just blind faith, there's a real historical case being argued here, that's already a step in the right direction. My invitation is this: don't settle for vague ideas of spiritual resurrection or Jesus living on in memory, if that's not what the earliest witnesses meant. They were staking everything they had on a concrete event in history. Either it happened or it didn't happen, but it deserves to be faced on its own terms. If this episode raised any questions, objections with you, or even frustrations, send them in. I'd love to tackle some of this in a future Q&A episode. Thank you for listening to Align Podcast. Cheers.